Hello, everyone. The reason you catch me with a big smile is that when we first did these, we were really, really good, and we all got on the call about 20 minutes, half an hour before they started. And in the last few days, we've cut things finer, and we just had one of those moments where we behaved exactly like we do in our old newsroom, which come bundling in for the start of a 1 o'clock thinking at 1 o'clock and start a little breathless. So uh, for those of you who work with me, you'll know that problem very well. For those of you who've been to a thinking before, you'll be aware that that's happened a fair few times. But for those who haven't, welcome to A Thinking. I'm James Harding. I'm editor and a co-founder here at Tortoise. My colleague Matt Dancona, also a fellow editor and partner at Tortoise, and I'm going to double hat this one. If you've not been to a thinking before, it's basically an open news meeting. You know, we've been up and running now for a year, and typically on a Tuesday, we essentially open the doors to the newsroom and ask people to come in, and we discuss the work that we're doing, hear from people what they think of it, the way in which we should progress it, but also open up to any ideas that people have of stories we should be doing. And so what Matt and I were going to try to do today was talk a little bit about the work that we're doing and try and get some help from you on how you think we should frame it and improve it. But as you know, the aim here is to be open in all of our journalism, and where there are new ideas, good ideas, do weigh in. If you've not come to a thinking before, or at least not to one of our digital thinkings, can I just do a little bit of doors to manual here? There's a really simple way of using these Zoom calls. If you want to say something, you'll see there's a chat button at the bottom of the screen. Do just chat. The great Liz Mosley, also one of our editors and partners, is here, making sure that everyone's can be heard, responding to thoughts, and also a prompt to me and Matt to say, oh yeah, let's come to you and hear from you directly. It's lovely when we can actually see you. So I keep my video on so that we can see you. Of course, there's not a requirement for that, but it's a great thing to do. The other thing just to say is, if you see the bottom participants tab, and forgive me if I'm telling you something you know already, you can just click on that, and when you do, if you want to, you'll see there's a little grey button that says raise hand. When you raise your hand, a little blue digital hand comes up, and you can join us. So listen, let me treat this, if it's okay with you, and there's little you can do if it's not, to just give you a quick roundup of what we've been doing. Firstly, on just sort of our big stories, our Tortoise files, one of the things we've tried to do is try and keep this kind of rhythm in terms of our journalism. I was once taught that you want to try and have, in any run of news, a mix of spinach and cheesecake, stuff that's good for you and stuff that's enjoyable. You're lucky this week, it's cheesecake, right? We have done letters from lockdown, and they are a series of people who've been invited in to just come and say, look, write for us a letter about anything at all. And they were inspired, if you like, a little by Alistair Cook's, Letters from America. The aim is you start with a small observation, and it takes you to a big or possibly even a small idea. You may have heard Mel Giedroyc gave a lovely one about little things. Simon Armitage, the poet laureate, this morning has revealed to us the joy of gloomy literature. Deborah Frances White is hilarious and a treat unto herself. I'll let you listen to it. But there is, by the way, an invitation with this, as well as a slice of cheesecake. If anybody in the thinking today wants to do a letter of lockdown of their own, please do. The idea is, write up to 1,000 words, no more. It can be shorter too, and then just, ideally narrate it. And so the aim is that you can actually hear the voice of the person as well as read it. That's been the big focus for this week. Next week, we're back much more spinach, trying to understand what has happened to the UK in the course of the past month. And Matt, I'll hand over to you on this, given that you're working on it.
Yes, well, thanks, James. I think what's worth reflecting upon is that coming up next week is what we've called the 28 Days Later anniversary, for the simple reason that it is, and it evoked in us some memories of the Danny Boyle film. And the reason for that is that it will on Monday will have reached the 28th day since the Prime Minister ordered the lockdown. And it's extraordinary to reflect how much has changed in such a short space of time. Things like the right to free assembly, the right to an education has not in itself been suspended, but schools have closed. A-levels have gone. We can't go out. We can only go to the shops for essentials. We remain in our houses, even though it's incredibly nice and warm outside. All these things have been almost normalized in fantastically compressed period of time. And I think we're almost like a country in shock. We're just adjusting in the very early stages of adjusting, not just to the impact of the illness. And I think by this stage, most of us know someone who's had it. Many of us will know, very sadly, someone who's died from it or come very close to dying. So there's that. And then there's all the other things, the collateral aspects of it, which are extraordinary and in many respects impermanent, but in others longer lasting. So one assumes that we'll be let out of our hutches at some point in the next year or so. But it's also the case that out of this will come a huge series of questions about how we operate as a nation and what we do, what work means, and what home life means, and what is required of the health service and the social care system, very much in the news today. So we're very keen to hear your views on that, because it's such a broad panorama. And what we've already discovered in Thinkins is that there's a rich seam of stories that you don't read about in the media normally, which is, I suppose, inevitably concentrating on the centre, Westminster, Whitehall, senior scientists and so on. But I think there's also literally many millions of human stories out there which are worth listening to and learning from.
Okay, Matt, thanks so much. We'd love to hear on that. One of the things on our minds, particularly if you heard the podcast that Kerry Thomas recorded with Dave Taylor last week, is the impact some of this is having on business, specifically small and medium-sized businesses. If you get a chance, do take a listen to it. It's one of those rare cases where a piece of really thorough journalism looks at a business, in this case Twycross Zoo. We learn what this pandemic is meaning, not just for the animals, but the 160 people who work there. I think that's well worth listening to. I know if you're a member of Tortoise and you know what we're doing well, you'll understand what the Tortoise network is, the effort we're making to ensure that our newsroom is really open to everyone, different walks of life, different points of view. We are incredibly busy, or when I say we, actually, Polly Curtis and her team are really busy on that. And Polly, do you mind just talking through just some of the network thinkings that we're running this week, just to give people a flavour of what we're working on? It's particularly driving the Unheard Voices theme that I know lots of people are finding really interesting, and was obviously the substance of our Tortoise File last week.
Yeah, thank you, James. So what we're doing on the Tortoise Network is bespoke thinkings for our network partners, who are charities and social groups and different movements that are really about connecting people. So in this time, they're all struggling to kind of bring their people together, have the conversations they usually have. So we're working with them to do thinkings in their world. And it's tapped into some really, really interesting conversations. So we are doing a whole series with the National Citizens Service, looking at what young people are doing and how they're managing this crisis. We're doing one of those a week. We are doing a series with something called the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and they are really like a research group for the social care and family justice system. So really they look at the whole system around taking children into care and how it works, and try to inject the evidence into it. They've got a big bit of funding for that. And we've done lots of reporting on family separation and how the state decides to intervene in family life. And we're now doing a series with them looking at how they've digitized the whole family court system, and really the unbelievable risks in that. When you look at the conditions for child abuse to thrive, it's about poverty, it's about families in close quarters. This crisis has all the ingredients for neglect and abuse to really get worse. At the same time, you've got social distancing, meaning that social workers can't do the same kind of observations, can't be involved in families as much. You've got the courts having to make the biggest decisions without meeting the people involved, and doing it all by video conferencing, which is incredibly kind of exclusive for people who might not have smartphones to take part in. So you've got a really kind of toxic mixture. And then of course you don't have the schools, which are the front line. They're the first, teachers are the first to spot when something's going wrong with the kids. So there's a really dangerous situation there. And actually last week we held a think-in on this with the Family Justice Observatory, and the president of the Family Court heard about it and has actually asked us to do more, working with them as a kind of consultation process, as a really deep, rapid, how is this working? What are the risks? Can we bring all these people together? But what we're then doing with these one-off think-ins is bringing those voices to our members as well. So what you'll see on Wednesday's Unheard Voices think-in that produced the file that we did last week is a series of people that we've met through our network think-ins that we really want to kind of give a bigger platform.
Sorry, I can't search what something is about.
Sorry. So we want to bring their voices to our membership, to give it a bigger platform, and to really expose those unheard voices. So in Wednesday's night's thinking, we're going to look at two things. One is the child protection system and what's happening there, but the other is about 0-hour contract workers, so people who are on low paid, insecure jobs. And we're bringing in some of our members from Grimsby, where we've done think-ins over the last 6 months, and we're doing a Grimsby local project. So we're bringing in some members who work in the kind of social care world and in the fish factories in Grimsby, to give a very different view to the one we're all experiencing, which is office life at home.
Okay, Polly, that sounds, I hope that makes sense to people. And Polly, if they're interested in getting involved in what's happening on the network, what do people do?
What do our members do?
Yeah.
Come to the Unheard Voices think-in on Wednesday. We would really love to see you there. You know, there is a hugely important thing about the network, which is just people being heard properly. So actually by coming and listening and sharing those ideas, it's really important. The network works, we give memberships to people via charities so that they can be part of the Tortoise community. We also fundraise to pay for those networks. So if anyone would like to become a patron of the Tortoise network and make sure that those unheard voices are really coming through in our journalism, we'd love to hear from you.
And Polly, apologies if you found me sort of grinning like a Cheshire cat as you were describing the troubled workings of the family courts. While you were doing that, my daughter had actually crawled in on all fours to take a pencil sharpener. She reached up, take a pencil sharpener off my desk, and then disappeared. So forgive me for sort of suppressed giggles. I'd like to go, if I could, to the sort of substance that a bunch of us were talking about earlier this morning, and is one of the big projects we've got for May. I think there's a risk, if you're a newsroom like ours that says that you're set up in a spirit of radical optimism, that you're struck by the sort of can-do spirit of this moment, and that you're making an argument consistently for how we harness this energy into a reset for the post-pandemic world, but then you never actually articulate what any of those ideas are, how any of those changes might work in practice. And so what Liz Mosley and Dave Taylor have been talking about is a series of think-ins that run every Wednesday through May that will articulate how we live next. And we've been trying to work out how we do that, how we do it in such a way that's not sort of theoretical and not sort of wide-eyed utopian, but is radical optimism in a practical way. I was struck, I don't know whether Josephine Moulds, you're still there, but I'd love to come to you, Josephine, just to think about it in the context of climate, because I'm not sure I entirely understand the point you're making in the chat about how people are shorting the climate change risk, but would be really interested to hear more about it. Can I, Josephine, is that all right if I come to you just in terms of a little bit about what you're doing or what you're working on? There you are. Hello. Oh, are you muted? Wait. Who has?
I'm unmuted.
Ah,
Hello?
there we are. Yes, you're unmuted, unbound, far away.
So as a reader, I'd love to read about, what this could mean in terms of actions to tackle climate change, because it could be a positive. People suddenly understand about behaviour change, hopefully business travel, academics travelling all around the world, that could be limited. But also all of the progress that's been made could potentially be rolled back just because everyone's desperate for an economic recovery. So anything investigating that, I think, would be really interesting. The thing I'm working on is, you know the movie The Big Short?
Yes, yes.
So I've met some traders who are now sort of shorting climate change risk. And it's just quite an interesting kind of financial idea, and it's potentially quite a positive story, just because a tiny shift in the capital markets could actually massively accelerate the energy transition.
And sorry, the shorting the climate risk is essentially betting on climate change and against the companies that accelerate it?
Yes, so people are doing it in different ways. The best guy is this slightly mad Swedish guy that I met, who he's basically a hedge fund trader. He used to work for the Swedish pension fund, and he's betting against debt from coal miners and people like that. So he's shorting that debt. And then as people turn against coal miners, as they're already doing, then his CDS, his credit default swaps, are suddenly worth a huge amount of money.
So his bet is that the price people charge coal miners to borrow is just going to keep on going up.
Yeah, and it's got a really good impact argument, because you're actually making it cost a huge amount more for them to borrow money. And so he did it before, like back in 2015, and a utility actually moved out of coal because they realised that was the reason, that it was costing them far too much to borrow money. So they just stopped using coal entirely. So he's targeting kind of, there's an Indian conglomerate that has lots of coal assets, and he's targeting people like that, saying, look, people haven't priced in the risk of them actually just owning those coal assets.
Right. Interesting. Okay, we'll definitely do that. The way we're going to try and do it, Josephine, is we're going to look each week at a particular issue. You know, we have these sort of big five, which is the way in which we organise the Tortoise newsroom, i.e. wealth, identity, our planet, new things, aka technology, and the 100-year life. And we're going to try and look at all of those. So alongside Giles Whittle, who's running this reporting project on how do we get to net zero by 2030 rather than 2050. That one will think about that in particular. I'm going to share the family joy, because I think that Alan Harding is my cousin Alan Harding, I hope so, who's noted the fact that actually it seems as though some of the spirit of early, yes he is, hello, some of the spirit of early sort of cooperation in politics has been replaced already by some sort of, you know, criticism of politicians, a more aggressive media. My colleague Alan, Chris Cook, pointed out in this morning's Sense Maker that the editorial columns of the national newspapers are back to that sort of landing points where they can. Are you saying that this is a time where we should be asking those awkward questions, or it is still a time for greater kind of political cooperation?
I definitely like to see more political cooperation. I think the media is filling up with people who are being awkward about what politicians and other folk in power are trying to do to solve the crisis. This crisis has never happened to any of them before. And in spite of the crisis management is a subject which governments should approach, very little has been invested in crisis management in the last decades, apart from the nuclear deterrent. So I really would like to see a situation where people are less critical. No one has been in a situation where they've had to face this problem before. And to have journalists, commentators, etc., taking people to task is not productive. What we need is productive and intelligent assistance to the people in power, not point scoring.
Well, on that note, I'm going to hand to Matthew. I tell you, we've got in the course of the rest of today's open thinking, what we'd love to hear, and this is equally from my colleagues who work at Tortoise, because obviously we don't sit in the newsroom together every day now, but also to our members, we're really interested to think on specific subjects. How do we make this series, How Do We Live Next, work? Right. So this morning we were discussing, is it about resilience for a world of future pandemics? Do we need to move from an efficiency economy to a capacity economy, from just in time to just in case? Do we need to think about what it's revealed about the things that we do in everyday life that perhaps we could do differently? It turns out we shelved the exam system this summer and everyone's going to be fine. Do we need an education system that moves on from exams? Could we make changes like that? If we can print money to deal with the coronavirus, could we print money to plant trees or invest in dementia research? We're really interested in those substantial issues. We're really interested too in focusing on how businesses are trying to cope with this. It seems as though that story has stayed in the business pages, but it's going to affect all of us for the next couple of years. And so whether instance of that would be really interesting to hear. And of course, we're trying to understand, Matt is trying to understand in particular, and that's why I'm going to hand it back to you, how we think the country has fundamentally changed, what it's revealed about itself in the course of the past month. So Matt, do you want to sort of start with your, sort of offer what your kind of starting thought is on that, and then I'll leave you to pick up on people who are going to chime in.
Of course. Thanks, James. Well, my starting point is that there are some people who think that things will simply go back to where they were before in a fairly short space of time. Matthew Paris wrote about this in the Times, and there are others have too. I don't think that's possible, if only because the economic and social fallout from this is going to be absolutely extraordinary. And on the day that we come kind of blinking out of our hutches, you know, it's going to be, there's going to be so much wreckage to clear up. In a sense, this is, though as hard as it is, it's the phony war before the real struggle. And what I kind of am fascinated to hear is what people, as they look ahead from this very strange vantage point of being in a struggle, but atomized. We're all kind of unusually in a struggle. We're not together. We're not shoulder to shoulder. We are literally separated. The separation is the struggle. So I'm kind of intrigued to hear what people are making of it, but also as they look ahead, perhaps to, you know, a couple of months down the road, what they're expecting life to be like. We know it's going to be difficult. We know it's going to be testing. But do they expect their children to be back at school? Do they expect their finances to be in a reasonable shape? What kind of struggles people anticipate in the near to medium term future? I'm just looking down to see. Tessa, my colleague TessaMurray has a hand up.
Hi, I thought I was eating my lunch at the same time, which is really rude. Hi. A couple of things struck me from some conversations I've had with friends over the last couple of days, one of whom is a teacher. And she was saying at their school they never had any idea which of their pupils were bursary pupils when they were teaching them in the classroom. She said, but now they've been remote teaching, it's really become very clear who is a bursary child because of their access to technology. So what struck me, the thing that I think that will come out of this is just how this is not a progressive illness. This is the gaps that we always worried about between social inequality it's like someone's dropped a bloody great amble on them. And I think those are the sort of fractures that will go through society that will be sure, we'll have to come back from a hard recession, but we can do that. We've done that after the credit crisis. We come back from wars. But it's that, we're all in it together, but we're so not all in it together. And that's the biggest challenge, I think, for us as a society post coming out of the virus. And also the equality of access to testing, vaccines, you name it, the health equality that needs to follow from this as well.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think that it's more like a tide that's swept out to sea, revealing everything that was on the seabed before, but we perhaps weren't quite willing to either confront or didn't know about. I'm interested in what's going on in the chat. Some debate on whether or not the government should have taken preemptive measures. Martin Ricks, are you there, Martin? Martin making some very interesting points about... Hi, Martin.
Hi there. Yeah, my view is, first of all, I don't see why criticism or holding to account shouldn't take place. I think that's how you make sure that governments, be it the UK government or any other government, is doing the best they can. You push them towards that. And not just allow them to get there. You need to encourage and push, and that is through criticism and holding account. That's been the story of politics forever. But I think we should also be levelling some criticism for the fact that we have seen papers published. I know this was a while ago, and it was under the new Labour government, but there was a paper published on pandemics, and a lot of the lessons weren't learned. We had the exercise in, I think it was September 2012. I can't remember. It was sometime under the Conservative government that the pandemic exercises run, a 3-day exercise, and the lessons learned from that obviously weren't implemented. 2016, there we go. And of course we had the disbandment of the pandemic, I think it's a working group, or I can't remember the exact name of it. But there are lessons that surely should have been learned over the last few years. If they weren't learned and the things haven't been implemented as a result, we should be criticising, we should be holding an account. That's why we have a free press, that's why we have opposition parties, that's their role. And so I encourage it. And if it makes everything better as a result, brilliant.
Yes, I suppose the real point is that one wants not just a kind of gotcha journalism, but a journalism that's going to make us more resilient to future shocks of this sort. I see Nathan's hand is up. Could we come to Nathan? Nathan PM Young. Hi, Nathan.
Yeah, I guess my main thought is quite similar to that, so I'll keep it short. It's just I think it definitely was predictable. So I'm quite into forecasting. I follow a number of the forecasting communities online, sort of Metaculus. And those communities have a very good hit rate of predicting future events. And not only do they think there would be some pandemic at some point, but they would also, like, you know, late January, people were really concerned about this. And I was concerned about it sort of mid-February. And I'm not particularly well informed or particularly intelligent. And I guess like the upset from me that my government, I mean, you saw Wimbledon had its pandemic insurance, which is just paid out. Like if a tennis tournament can do it, so can the UK government.
And do you the forecasters you follow, Nathan, do you find them having anything of use to say about what will happen as we exit this?
Yeah, so I think the median date of exit on the forecasting community is currently early June in the UK. I mean, obviously that that might change, but people can go onto Metaculus. It has forecasts for the exit days of numerous countries, and there's forecasting about numbers of deaths, there's forecasting about number of cases, and numerous other things. Often it's like very specific rather than sort of broad models. But yeah, there's a lot of very specific forecasts that you could get to try and inform your picture.
Could we come to Jelena now, who's had her hand up, I think, for a while? Hi, Jelena.
Can you hear me?
We can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear, thank you.
Can you hear me? Perfect. I just wanted to come back to a point that Tessa made, really, about how the impact of the coronavirus is being felt very unevenly, and I think that more reporting is starting to pick up on that now. I read a really interesting piece, I think it was in The Guardian, either yesterday or the day before, by Christine Berry, where she spoke about how not only is the impact of the coronavirus being felt more by obviously those from a lower socioeconomic background now, but that will continue to be the case as we see these policies come into effect. So for instance, she was talking about the bailout system and how that's more benefiting either rentiers or landlords or the banks themselves rather than the people who are going to be ultimately directly affected by those policies. And I think for all the talk that we've had of, it being so out of the ordinary, really, that you've got a Conservative government who ushering in all of these high spending policies, ultimately it's important that we remember that this could just as easily result in a new era of austerity, and consider where those economic effects are really going to be felt in the long term.
Do you think it will, Jelena? Do you think there will be more austerity? Because I mean, you'd think, just as a matter of sort of political reality, that any government that tried a second wave of austerity would find itself in a very, very difficult space electorally.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I've been thinking about this a lot with respect to Keir Starmer as well, whether we're going to see another sort of 1945 moment where the UK decides to kick out the person who leads them through the crisis for something completely new. I think it's more likely, to be honest, that we will see a kickback of austerity measures, because the approach that the Conservative government had taken up until this point is that fiscal conservatism is necessary in order to then use those funds in case of a crisis. So I think it will just be more of a return to that kind of style of politics.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. I'd like to come to Katie Vanneck-Smith, who you may know is a co-founder with James of Tortoise. Hi, Katie.
Hi there. Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yep, absolutely, loud and clear.
A completely different point, although I agree with lots of the things that are being said. Actually, I sent a link from Facebook to James earlier today. I wanted to come back to a story that we ran quite early on. We ran up early on the story around the infodemic, the sort of fake news that's swirling around. And today, 3 people that I know had shared this link from a guy called Wayne Dupre, who's an alt-right conservative in the US. He's got his own show over there, and it's a 55-minute documentary. And so they've obviously gone to a lot of effort to make it. And it basically is sort of putting out there that the virus itself is not natural and has had to be spliced together through SARS and bats and HIV. Actually, is this what this documentary says? And I know this came out early on, and we've heard lots about all the work that Facebook and a lot of these platforms are doing to sort of stop fake news. But it strikes me that that this still going doing the rounds, and actually the longer this goes on, the more sophisticated the techniques are becoming. And actually a 55-minute documentary is a pretty significant amount of fake news creation in many ways, and it's sort of it looks very real. So I just wondered whether we were planning on coming back to that story at any point, whether there was any data that had come to light. I just thought it was fascinating to see. We saw this early on, but it's now coming back again in different formats and different voices.
Yes, and I guess that it's now possible to make a 55-minute documentary a lot more easily and at almost zero cost, in a way that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. I'm wondering if we can come to Josh Shah, who's got some very interesting things to say about the exam conundrum that we've been discussing on and off. Josh, hi.
Hi. Yes, so I'm currently a Year 13 student, so I will be the first year of kids that will be affected by this. And I understand that the Black and Asian ethnic minorities, I guess people feel that we will be more disadvantaged. But I think I'm less uncertain about this because they have to give a lot of evidence to the examining body. But I think the bigger issue for our students is when we will start university, if we will have to sit exams, but then also how that will affect our ability to get a job later, because I'm pretty sure most of my friends, I go to a pretty well achieving school, we're sure we'll get into university, whether it's this year or next year, but it's about the long term. We're not sure about our job prospects or whether firms will have the capacity to accept undergraduates or college students. So that's, I think, the bigger issue for me anyway, and my peers, than just the grades, because they shouldn't be too unjust, in my opinion.
Do you think, sorry, Josh, do you think you'll be in a situation potentially where there's a narrowing of opportunity specifically because of the fallout from COVID, or are you talking specifically about the problems with the exam system? Just some understanding.
Right, so I think it's both. So the exam system is an issue, and the grades, they might not be respective of what we will achieve, but I think it is more about firms and in the future jobs, that more so.
That's really interesting, thank you. And I would like to come now to my colleague Xavier Greenwood. Xav, are you there? Hi Xav, you had some interesting points in the chat. Can't hear?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I was just kind of reflecting on what my sister's going through at the moment, because she goes to quite a badly performing kind of local village state school in North Yorkshire, and I mean, she's in quite a bad state in terms of how the school has dealt with the whole exam situation, and I feel leaving a lot of the process up to individual schools and individual teachers feels like it's fraught with quite a lot of danger. I mean, to talk about my sister's school in particular, they have a tendency to under-predict well-performing students and over-predict badly performing pupils. In terms of the mock exams, which I think are being taken into account for grades, there were pupils who cheated, who were given no kind of major punishments, and I don't know what's happening with them. There were some subjects where pupils were told not to revise for mocks and to focus on coursework, and so I think when you're relying on things like predicted grades and mocks, and you're just removing what the ultimate corrective to all these ways in which schools don't function properly, you're removing that ultimate corrective, which is being able to do the exams at the end. And I do think, even if there is an opportunity for pupils to kind of take exams in September if they're not happy with their grades, I think in terms of when people start university and in terms of all other pressures which will be coming down the line in September, it's still hardly fair if a bunch of pupils have to do that because they don't think their teachers are kind of have been treating them fairly.
So it's interesting, Zab, because it's one of the points that's often argued against the exam system is that it's, it favours the private sector, it favours coaching, it favours money, it favours privilege, and so on. What you're saying is that to some extent it's actually a slightly better leveller?
Well, I'm not sure whether it's kind of a better or worse leveller, but I don't think that going off predicted grades and going off mocks is in any way a leveller. I think as soon as there's a really, and I'm not sure if this pattern is replicated elsewhere, but my sister's school, which again is very badly performing, I think only 2 people ever have got into Oxford and Cambridge from that school, there's a real tendency from teachers to kind of talk pupils down or to discourage them from being ambitious, from applying to Oxbridge, from doing all these different things. And there's always really well reflected in predicted grades. And I think if you're leaving it up to teachers to decide what marks their pupils will get, I think you're leaving it too much up to the whim of individual teachers. And I think private schools always have, I think just often have the sense and nous to know kind of how to play the system a bit better. And so I think private school pupils will basically do fine out of this. And I think state school pupils in many state schools will be punished.
Coming back to James, thanks, Zav.
Can I speak up on a couple of things, Matt, if it's all right? I mean, I just think they're worth pursuing. I think, Zav, the point is, and the point I suppose Josh just on exams, I saw Harika made the point too, being really uncertain about what teachers would do. I suppose my starting point on the exams question is that, you know, we've always sort of treated the exam system as something sacred. You couldn't somehow entrust, you know, people's futures, which university, what job they'd get, to something other than exams. And yet when push comes to shove, we scrap the exam system, and no one has suggested, oh, let's get all of those people to retake their exams. I'm not saying that the answer is teacher assessment or coursework, but it's certainly an opportunity to rethink it, because we know that we've got a massive social mobility problem. We know that that education is the place where you could do most to fix it. It feels like there's a moment, there's an opportunity there. I just wanted to pick up on two other things that have been made in the course of the conversation. There's a really interesting point from Chris Chadwick about how do we deal with fake news in the system. I find myself sort of in totally two minds about the intervention that's happened from the Silicon Valley giants around use of digital technology around tracing and tracking, because on the one hand, you think it's fantastic. On the other hand, you're sort of flabbergasted that these companies who for so long have said, look, we provide services to consumers, we're not in the business of trying to solve public policy problems, have suddenly stepped in with a massive intervention, big changes to data and privacy as a result, but a massive intervention to try and deal with a public policy problem. What that suggests to me is that we can have a new deal with the likes of Apple and Facebook and Google if we want to. And I realize that, Chris, you were raising a specific point about our sourcing on digital media. I'd point you to Claudia Williams, my colleague. She did a really interesting piece last year, in fact, about super fans on social media sites. It was called Standoff, I think, if I remember rightly. And the thing that's interesting about it is, how do you source people that you've never met, that you're only identifying online? And then the one thing was just to sort of wave at Yasmin, because I think that the point she's making about, sort of way back in the chat, about the lag on the inequality problem, that's the thing I'm really, really worried about. I think that in the reporting, we're going to see deaths in hospitals and deaths in care homes. What I don't see us reporting is how people in vulnerable businesses, particularly small businesses, get into the public eye. And their problems will be chronic, not acute, but potentially as difficult and painful as any. So those were just responses to some of the points here. I see, as I've been talking, a whole bunch of people have put their hands up. Chris Cook, my colleague, is no doubt going to set me straight on the exam system. Chris, are you there?
Take it away, Chris.
Exactly. So I think you have to think of England in particular. I use England advisedly, is going through the aftershocks of the single most effective social policy reform of the post-war era still, which is the introduction of the GCSE. So prior to the introduction of the GCSE, we assumed that basically the majority of kids weren't going to get into, didn't need proper school leaving qualifications. Majority of them didn't get them. The CSE wasn't taken seriously. And a lot of what we talk about, we take for granted about a lot of when we talk about social mobility, what we're really talking about is the fact that we remain in shock at the inequality of the school system, which we only really found out about in the 1980s when we introduced the GCSE and when it was introduced in the early 1990s. And one of the things that we used to have in England was a school system which was much more teacher-led and allowed a lot more variation between schools. And what happened in that scenario is that kids for poor kids became poor schools, and kids for rich kids became schools for rich kids became good schools. And the thing that holds us together, the thing that forces us to keep confronting the problems of social mobility, is the public exam system. So I'd be really nervous about undoing the Ken Baker stuff, which is creating a single exam that every child takes, basically. And while we might be able to get through a year without a single exam for one cohort, the structural benefits of a single exam system, I'd be very strongly in favour of. There we are. I've finished now.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Can we go to Chris Chadwick, who's still got his hand up, please? Hi, Chris. We can't hear you just yet. Could you unmute? Can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, beautiful alpine background.
Thank you. Just on that point about education, I'll tell you what, something I find interesting about the education is where the evidence is that the way that we're doing education in the UK currently works. Because I was involved as an independent consultant with the University of Manchester, and we did some research when there was a move to try and bring more computing into education. And what I did was I got two groups of 30 children. One group, we just gave them access to technology and said, you've got 40 minutes to find out all that you can about winemaking in the Dordogne Valley in France. And then we had two teachers with a similar group of children to teach them for 40 minutes about the same subject. And we had two Ofsted inspectors who observed both groups, and they measured the educational attainment at the end of the 40 minutes. And what, to my absolute amazement, that there was no difference in the educational attainment within the 40 minutes. And that was using teachers to direct the learning, as opposed to giving children access to technologies to be able to discover for themselves. Now, what that raised for me was an interesting question about who's doing the evaluation of actually what works. My brother at the time lived in Norway, and Norway has a particular approach to education, which is about giving autonomy to the child. And I thought, you know, that's why I did the experiment, really. And I think children are much, much more capable than most teachers think they are. And when I was doing that work, the thing that I found most difficult about bringing fundamental change into a school was the limited thinking of those people who've been in education for the longest. In other words, that's not to say that teachers are not great and that, you know, I praise them for what they do, but sometimes our ability to do things differently is limited by what we know.
Thanks, Chris. I see my colleague Jack Kessler has his hand up. Jack, can we come to you? Hi, Jack. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point, just listening to the gentleman, forgive me, whose name I forget, who is soon to leave school, and the evidence that exists, that cohorts who graduate, particularly from university during recessions, they don't often will start out in careers and jobs that don't require undergraduate or graduate education, but then they don't actually catch up. They will earn less money decades later throughout their careers. There's an incredible article from the Harvard Business Review, which shows that even people who become CEOs later in life, when having graduated during a recession, tend to be CEOs of smaller, less prestigious companies than their counterparts who graduated during better economic times. It's just astonishing that it stays with people for decades after.
Is that, sorry to interrupt, is that attributed to a kind of a combination of psychological factors and also the narrower experiences and opportunities available during a recession? What are the,
it's funny you mentioned psychological, because actually the article goes on to say that these people are generally happier than their more successful or better paid counterparts. I don't know what that's attributed to. But just the fact that people do not catch up, it sort of seems to be the reverse of the advantage of sort of men who are graduating after the First World War, and the survivors generally had much better careers because they had fewer people going for the same jobs.
It's very interesting. Could we come back to Jelena, who's had her hand up for a while? Jelena, hi. There you go, loud and clear.
Can you hear me now? Perfect. Yeah, I think I could talk about the education system and how I think the coronavirus is going to affect it till the cows come home. But I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. I think that Zav and Josh were both really correct to say that in its current form, the government responses are going to, firstly, disadvantage immediate students, so this year's cohort the most, and also that's really going to disadvantage students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, because yes, we now have this wealth of resources that students can access online, but that's dependent on having an internet connection. It's basically going to exacerbate the effect of the summer learning loss that we currently have anyway, because we have long summer holidays. And I think James is correct in pointing out this is an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that can only be fully taken advantage of if we have long-term planning and reform of the education system and the wider systems more broadly that shape it. So it's part of austerity politics as well, I suppose. The fact that we've had 8% cuts per pupil in spending since 2010, and even the 2019 plans to introduce more spending would only reverse that gap. It wouldn't actually contribute to improving the system. And I think it's interesting, everyone talks about autonomy for teachers, and there's a big worry about teacher marking being very subjective. But partly that's bred into our education system, because over time we've sapped teacher autonomy entirely, and there doesn't seem to be, if not respect, then sort of an understanding that teachers can produce their own lesson plans, and that there should be some, nuance between schools and the way that certain things are taught. So I think that's an interesting side effect that we might see after this year as well, with the introduction of teacher marking. And I suppose generally, like, the final point is that we've presided over the long-term commodification of learning and of schools. And I think that's had a really high effect with respect to accountability. There's pressure through Ofsted and the examination system itself for students and teachers to perform or achieve. And actually, when you compare the results of our education system to other systems, whether they're really high-performing schools in Asia, and Estonia recently has really developed its education system, it's basically modelled on a completely different approach to ours, where we have all ability where they rather have all ability schools and classes, because everything is founded on the notion that everyone should succeed rather than having this hierarchy of success. So for instance, a lot of the top schools in Asia will pair the best teachers with the weakest students in order to ensure that everyone gets up to a basic standard. And in Estonia, the teachers have so much more autonomy with respect to their national curriculum, things that are taught. There are less exams as well, but they're just other points to think about with respect to how we can grasp this opportunity to reform the education system moving forward.
Thank you, Jelena. I'd like to, time's marching on, so I'd like to go back to James, who I know has some thoughts.
I just wanted to pick up, Matt. I just wanted to pick up, if I could, on this sort of the thread that's going on in the chat around immigration. I see that, Yasmin and Martin and a bunch of others are having this conversation, Zav too. So for what it's worth, we had exactly this conversation earlier this morning. We were doing our long-term commissioning meeting about some of our Tortoise files. And one of the questions on my mind is, how do we do a kind of textured piece about immigration, in that obviously this has been a subject which has so much shaped our politics in the last 10, 20 years. In some ways, you're getting a reframing of it in some of the ways that Yasmin, for example, points out. You're also getting some real changes in terms of the facts. So you've got the new system that's being put in place by the Home Office. There's also a big question to my mind, which is what happens if a large number of people have left the UK in the last 3 to 4 weeks, and what happens in terms of who does and doesn't come back. There's a whole debate around the kind of political framing of immigration, the policy making around immigration, and the economic realities of immigration that seem like there's a really important seam there to explore. But I really find it sort of one of those things that's not very helpful when you theorize, and much better when you tell a story or a series of stories. So I just wanted to flag that up to both people in, Tortoise colleagues and Tortoise members, to say I'm really interested to see how we could do that in a way that really informs